Hello, I'm Dr. Matt Silverstein, and I have the pleasure today of speaking with Dr. Fanny Brewster. And first, I'll briefly introduce myself. I am based in Los Angeles, and I teach with Antioch University, Los Angeles, in the Department of Psychology. And I run a little program called Spiritual and Depth Psychology. And I would like to introduce my guest today, Dr. Fanny Brewster, who is a Jungian analyst and author of poetry and nonfiction. Her books include African Americans in Jungian Psychology, Leaving the Shadows, published in 2017, and Archetypal Grief, Slavery's Legacy of Intergenerational Child Loss, published in 2018, and The Racial Complex, a Jungian perspective on culture and race, which was published in 2019. And soon to be published will be a book entitled Race in the Unconscious, a depth psychology perspective on dreaming. And that's going into press this fall. And all of these publications, I believe, are through Routledge. And she's currently co-authoring a book with a British Jungian analyst named Helen Morgan. And I believe that covers all of the publications. Dr. Brewster can let us know in a moment if there's more. Dr. Brewster is also a core faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Carpinteria, California, and the Philadelphia Association of Jungian Analysts. She's an international lecturer and workshop presenter on Jungian psychology and recognized as an honored leader in the field addressing issues including collective trauma, racial relations, and diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you for that introduction.
It's great to talk today, and we were going to talk particularly today about an upcoming event that you will be facilitating virtually at Antioch University in Los Angeles. And we're going to talk more about that event. It's happening on May 23rd from 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. And Dr. Brewster will be bringing together a number of different depth psychologists who will be offering a variety of modalities, including art therapy and dream work, active imagination, some somatic oriented work, and also some writing exercises. And that is with the intent of looking into the community psyche or the community unconscious and seeing what we might gather about a way forward out of the hardship that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has represented for us. And that class is being called Healing After the Darkness, Bringing the Light. Yeah, and we spoke last year when you came to talk with our community last year. And I remember I was listening to the talk, as I mentioned a little earlier today when we were talking, that it was notable in that it was the beginning of the pandemic, relatively. And we were talking about really the intersection between the health crisis of the pandemic and the social crisis of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on people of color, of communities of color in particular. And we were just talking about the varying levels of the poison of the virus. And you had mentioned the imagery of finding the remedy in the poison, finding the remedy in the poison, finding the healing in the poison. And that was something that we talked about a little bit. And it seems to me now, even on the other end, well, we'll see, at least at this next stage of the pandemic, where there has been at least some kind of medical intervention that's been formulated, and we're all sort of a walking laboratory or research project on whether and how that's
Mhm.
going to go.
Mhm.
I've got that in me. I think we'll see. But
Mhm.
we've got something at that medical level, but we don't know, right? At the social level, there has been some major developments this year. Um, there was the George Floyd protests which spread across the world actually.
Mhm.
And we've had recently the trial of Derek Chauvin, who was um, who was held accountable for his murder, a white man who was held accountable for his murder of George Floyd, and will spend the rest of his life in jail, and that was historic in a in a way considered a milestone, although a lot of people um, are skeptical about the degree to which that's actually going to change anything systemically. But there have been these developments, and here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, as I listen to people talk in the collective and listen to how they're feeling about what's going on, it's like we're all understanding that Chauvin's conviction is not a time to relax or to feel that we have reached some sort of conclusion to social injustice because it's still happening, and in the time that 20 minutes before Micaiah was 20 minutes before that um, came to a conclusion, that trial, she was shot and killed 4 times in Columbus, Ohio, and others have been killed since then
Mm-hmm.
by policemen and women, not just men. And so, we're still in that conversation around um, people of color being murdered and having their families go through the torture of their deaths. And so this in social injustice, it's for the lifetime, at least this generation, right? And we could say that there is some more, there's some more awakening, right? There's more of an awakening to like, oh, there are conversations that we could be having, should be having about racism. And the lines could be, more tightly drawn, like around white nationalism, or, more tightly drawn around, um, this is who we are and America belongs to white people. Because I do hear people saying that. And, um, and you people, you others don't belong here. This is our country, right? So we're not, we're not at any kind of, I don't think, huge resolution. Um, People are, I hear people talk about how, like with Chauvin's trial, uh, and him being convicted, like that's a huge um, movement forward in having that blue line kind of cracked or broken up in some way. But I just think that there's so much weight in the history of where we've come from with racism that healing is going to take, was 400 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that the healing is going to take every ounce of our efforts in
Mm-hmm.
every way possible to keep moving it forward. So um, we had to see George Floyd murdered in order to get a conviction for a policeman. And there had been so many others before him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's to me the very sad part about what's happening. and what I think continues to happen in terms of social injustice.
Mm. Mm. So I'm I'm thinking about this community gathering and
Mhm,
the invitation, healing after the darkness. And I thought maybe
mhm,
we could reflect on that a little bit, because clearly
mhm,
we're not after any darkness
mhm,
necessarily, but at the same time there is this, it's spring, and
mhm,
you know, there has been some relief for a good number of people with COVID. Things are
mhm,
certainly, it's still relatively unclear. Um, there perhaps has been arguably some slight incremental change in terms of civil rights. I don't know. But
mhm,
and at the same time, you're saying, look, settle into it, because we're in maybe a 100 or couple 100 year long recovery process,
mhm,
if I've heard you correctly. Um, and so what are we healing, and after what darkness would you
mhm,
say, going into this
mhm.
gathering? How do we
Yeah,
think about that?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that there is a way in which we learn how to be in the darkness, right? And I know I hear some people say, oh, this is so uncomfortable. These conversations that we're having around whiteness and around um, having to look at unconscious racism in white people, right? Like them having to do that kind of self reflection. And I say, well, people of color are traditionally in the discomfort because we are, can be put to the side in whatever way we have been historically. So it's always a bit edgy, right? It's always a bit scary. It's always a bit of the unknown, and it's dark, right? It can be really dark. So with darkness, you learn your eyes adjust to the darkness. And I think that that's perhaps more of how we need to be thinking about this. And in depth psychology, Jungian psychology, it's like shining the light on the darkness,
Mm,
right? And so as our eyes become, I think of it like this, as our eyes become adjusted to the darkness, then we see more that's going on. And yes, there's still shadow because there's always shadow, right? And the darkness is not fully gone, but our eyes and our vision can bring lightness to what's happening. So I think of it more like that rather than being in a totally post darkness period.
mm,
Because with shadow, I don't think that that actually ever happens. And because we're human and we have these archetypal patterns too, like we have these archetypal patterns of like slave master. We see it acted out nowadays with children and with women who are enslaved, right? Human trafficking is our modern day version of that same archetypal energy taking place. So we don't get rid of these things, right? We don't get rid of these unconscious processes, but we make that adjustment. Jung talked about therapy being adaptation, right? Like coming in and receiving something new for the system, for the body, for the psyche, and then we leave again. And then, but always with shadow, because we always have that. So if we look at the shadow of racism and we look at how we live with it, and if we look at a racial complex, because complexes don't go away either, then we are in that process all the time.
mm,
So we, in doing what we're attempting to do at Antioch, right? Which is not attempting, but will be doing actually. We have attempted to do it. Now we're doing it in a few weeks, right?
mm,
Having this gathering that we do that's about healing. I think that my idea of healing is that it happens conjointly with the shadow. Like we can't have one without the other. And I think for a long time in American society, we had shadow, no light going on to it, only minimally, right? And no big attempt at lightness, seeing the light, if you will, um, by more white individuals in the society. So now we have more people willing to see in the dark,
Mm,
right? To see into the darkness and to see shadow, their shadow, personal and collective, in terms of raciality in our society. And so I think that that's what brings whatever light we can have. So what we're doing at Antioch is having a gathering that says we can do healing while we're holding that everything is not, there is no perfection here. There is us doing the work of being in the healing and healing our individual selves, because, and that will be intermittent, right? We don't stay healed, but hopefully the deepening gradually heals over time, which is what we hope for in the collective in terms of racism.
mm,
That's how I think about that.
mm. Thank you. I'm having
Welcome.
I'm having a different understanding already of after the darkness. I'm having this image of going into the night. So we say like it's after dark.
Mm-hmm.
It's nighttime. So it's healing after dark. Like how do we heal after as we go into the night together? Somehow I'm
Mm-hmm.
having that association as opposed to the thought that it's somehow behind us, like we're somehow over the darkness. We're
Mm-hmm.
actually moving into the darkness. That's how I'm hearing. And that's where the
Mm-hmm.
healing is. Have I heard you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like, and when you and I first talked about this over a year ago, right?
Mm,
And putting something together, this part of what we wanted to do with more of a focus on healing, I don't think that we were exactly thinking about it and talking about it like this, right? I think we were thinking about it as a post pandemic
yeah.
consciousness of healing,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And yeah, yeah, like thinking about the body, thinking about what happened with George Floyd being murdered, thinking about social injustice, like, but certainly with the pandemic, that and how it was affecting, disproportionately affecting people of color, and looking at it in a post-pandemic way. But now that we have been with it and lived with it and learned more from the scientist, right? Like we see, oh, we may be needing vaccinations like what, every 6 months, once a year? Like,
Mm,
what are you talking about? They don't know. They don't have the
mm,
data.
mm,
And so we would still, perhaps many of us, be still living in that kind of semi-dark space. And then there are those who don't want to be vaccinated. There are individuals who are still not trusting the medicine, still not trusting the government that gives us the medicine, and just feel like they don't need it. They don't need that. So we may not get to herd immunity. And what does that mean for us? Right? That's something to think about. So then that would mean you would need constant booster shots for this virus. Um, yeah, so it's not the way we first conceived about talking about post darkness, right? Like this is different than we imagined, which is back then, like a year ago, a little over a year ago. It's different. And that's how it is, though. That's how living spontaneously um, is engaged, right? It's engaged like, oh, we have more knowledge now, more information. So now this is a different place. So now what do? We adapt, like Jung talked about, right? Like, and what is that adaptation?
that's a really good question. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm seeing that I'm somehow having the association of the intersection of capitalism. When you talked about those 6 months booster shots, I'm like, ching ching, like every every round of
Mm-hmm.
those, probably that represents billions of dollars of
Mm-hmm.
income to big pharma. I mean, that may be
Mm-hmm.
that may be a misunderstanding, but that's certainly an impression. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, even as we move through this phase of sort of this next step of looking into the social unconscious vis-a-vis the complex of racism, which you've called the racial complex. How does that also, in a sense, also get sort of congealed with or slathered over with uh, capitalistic trends? And that in some way that bundle is coming to mind. And I'm just going to associate one more part of that, and it may or may not link up, but I'm thinking that as more white people wake up, and it seems that you've mentioned that seems to be a phenomenon, there is also this kind of parallel process in which, at least in my experience, leading mixed groups, and I'm white identified, just to disclose that because we're talking and people may not know. Um, there is a way in which I think white people are struggling about how to show up into the discussion because that white guilt and shame and fragility can kind of take over. And there's also a kind of an obliviousness to the amount of work. We were talking a little earlier about the amount of work it can take as a person of color, as a Black woman, to just hold the activation of the traumatic material when it's present. That alone is represents a kind of work that may not be well recognized by white counterparts. And I just wonder how it is that we find, how are we going to find that adaptation together? And I think it includes, at least as it's been surfacing right now in group work, it includes this particular place of tension, because that wokeness is one part of it, but then it's also realizing that somehow just sharing that in a group is not necessarily that helpful often, especially in a mixed group.
Yeah, yeah, that's the thing about being a person of color and in this time period. Like we're having more conversations, people of color as well as whites, right? Like who's carrying what burden, right? There used to be this phrase, right? The white man's burden.
Mm,
And I think that does have something to do with guilt, has white guilt. There's also such a thing I've heard people talk about, white humility, right?
mm,
So we have nowadays, even more so than when you and we had our last gathering at Antioch, more language, because when we met, I talked about the racial complex and I talked about how we have to create a lexicon, right? We have to create the language to discuss um, what we are talking about, because we don't even know what we're talking about, because we don't know what we don't know, right? So there's this way in which we have to be able to get language so that we're on the same page and we can be with one another psychologically and have a joining of an understanding of what something means. Because my take on it is that so much of this is coming from the unconscious self, right? Individual unconsciousness as well as group unconsciousness, unconscious racism, the unconscious, the collective unconscious. So then, what do we do with that,
mhm.
right? Like, where does that go? Like, something has to happen um, in terms of what we're talking about, how we understand what we're talking about, and then comes the idea of, well, how do we look at unconscious racism, and then how do we think about healing? Is that possible? And if I say, well, then complexes don't go away, but we befriend them, we see them, we shine the light on them, we get a better understanding. We then say, like, becoming more awake for everyone, right? Is people of color saying, well, I don't want to do your work for you. I'm not your burden. Carry your own Sisyphus stone and do what you need to do in order to create more love, more care, more healing, more consciousness, more ability. You carry your load. Like, we, people of color, that's a part of I think it's like an intergenerational discomfort with a capital D, right? Like, we carry that for centuries, not just the physical labor in our bodies, but that we had to do as slaves, right? But to carry that, all the weight of we're the problem, right? Like Du Bois talked about that, like, we are the problem. And so therefore we have to be fixed, and there's something wrong with us in the collective, like, but all the white people and other people are fine. It's just us, right? So that's pretty weighty. And we're saying, like, no, we're not the problem, right? Like, do some self-reflection. White folks, right? Do some white self-reflection, and then we can talk maybe more when there's no pressure on us as being the problem, right? So that's, I don't know if that responds to what you were saying, but I feel like I touch on it somewhat, right?
Yes. Yes, and I'm thinking about the messiness of the problem surfacing, the social problem surfacing, and I'm imagining even into our community gathering that if we're inviting people to look into their own inner lives, and we were going to do that through a number of means, through writing, through artwork, through dream work, there's going to be these themes that will surface, and we might see the themes about the pain of carrying a burden, or the the pain of shame and guilt, or the worry of not saying or doing the right thing, or the sense of helplessness that there isn't a clear sense of direction or a way forward. And all kinds of themes, of course, are emerging. And I guess the question is, you also talked about the theme of love and finding and cultivating love and caring and empathy. And I just wonder how we can respond to the sense of enormity of the intergenerational, the pain of the intergenerational trauma, I think, which is daunting to all of us in different ways, because there is this tendency to just want to, at least for some people, and some part of myself, I'm sure, that just wants to bury my head under the sand, or just go into the deep woods and just sort of, I don't know, find a place in which somehow that legacy is more manageable. And of course, that's just the exact opposite of what's needed. Not to say that going into the deep woods isn't a great thing. Uh,
Yeah.
but how do we bring the light, to go to that idea? How do we bring the light with an appreciation of the gravity of the task at hand, and not just get, I don't know, totally freaked out by the prospect?
Mhm. Well, I think that there's something about allowing ourselves to think about actually being freaked out rather than trying to prevent being freaked out. Like, I don't think that there's any value in, like, trying not to be freaked out when it's part of our human nature to be freaked out. Like, we're scared about things that we don't know, we don't understand. The ego does not like chaos. It's like, I don't think that we can prevent things that are part of our nature, like being afraid, like fear is an emotion, like we want to have joy. but oh, don't let me be afraid. No, it's like I want to have joy, and sometimes I'm going to be scared too. What about that, right? And bringing that into the conversation, like, I don't know what to say because I'm afraid, like being a white person, and I do hear this sometimes at presentations, like I'm a white person and I don't know what to say. I don't know how to have conversations with Black people. I never had a conversation really with a brown person. Like I never talked to them. I never discussed anything. I certainly never discussed race with them or ethnicity because we're all one race. But, I never had those kinds of conversations. How do I even begin to have those conversations? There's fear there, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so it's like, what do you do when you're afraid of something? You jump in, right? Like you get some courage together and you do the thing that you're afraid to do. And that's why it's so important, and it's been so important. And I stress this with the racial complex book. It's like, let's put these two words out there and open them up so that we can see what's happening with raciality and psychological processes that has been talked about in psychology, the field of psychology, for over 100 years. Like the complex is not something that we haven't talked about. We talked about a guilt complex. Everybody knows about that, tied to mythology, Greek mythology, right? We've talked about a mother complex, a father complex, a money complex. It's like all these different kinds of complexes, and yet we have stayed away from talking about a racial complex, which is what Jung talked about. He called it a color complex like 100 years ago. And the important part about that is that we have to bring language into our consciousness, into our everyday conversations where we can land on the same page and understanding what it means and deepening our understanding what it means so that we can speak to and address unconscious psychological processes. And a part of that is healing, like knowing that complexes don't go away, that we have to shine some light on them, or else we're just going to be not just in the dark, in the shadow, but with blindfolds on. Like we've made it worse, being in the dark, by not having language for these things, by not knowing, oh yeah, there is such a thing as unconscious racism. Oh, by not thinking about one's own personal shadow in terms of racism and raciality. So it's like on and on, right? So we need language, and we need to be able to be willing to be afraid. There's always suffering. There's always suffering, right? Like there's always shadow. So part of that suffering is, oh, I don't know about this thing. It scares me to have discussions about raciality. I don't know about Black people, or I don't know about white people. Like I don't know about their cultural stuff. I just know the stereotypical things that I know. And you could stay with that, or you could wake up more, like being woke, right? That's what that's about. Like being willing to be awake to something else, even though it's darkness, and you are in the darkness, and you're allowing yourself to adapt to the darkness in a way, and being able to, in that darkness, being able to have something that could be visioned or envisioned in a different way. And you're not blindfolded, right? You're not turning a blind eye. Like you're able to learn how to see in the darkness. And to me, that's a part of the healing, because you're going to be afraid. What life is there where you never get afraid? I don't know.
Mm.
I don't know. I wish if that's something I could drink, I would take it, maybe like my potion that says, okay, now I never have to worry about being scared by anything again. But isn't that a part of the work? Because it's
Mm.
part of being alive, right?
Mm. I mean, one thought is that through processes like inner work or through really dedicated meditation or other spiritual practice, perhaps ultimately there is more inclusion of what it is that's scary about the mind and about the world that makes it perhaps more manageable in the long term. But that's the best case outcome. I want
Mhm.
I wanted to
Yeah.
kind of circle back to another perspective though on fear, or actually maybe it's frustration, which I've
Okay.
heard from people of color who are in mixed groups who are grappling with race in the racial complex. And what I've heard and felt is just a sense of just frustration that I mean, and also maybe mm, just aggravation. Like the felt sense is that it's just difficult to be in a group where white people are kind of coming to terms with something that a person of color may have been living with their whole life. And it's like, okay, this person is having a realization in this group. And while that's helpful perhaps for them in this moment, there's something about it that just seems a little bit perhaps like it just it's just hard to hear. You know, it just gets I mean, it's going too far to say that it just kind of is an eye roll experience, but it's almost like that. Like just, you know, there's something there's a way in which it can turn into how white privilege is getting expressed, but it's sort of insidiously about the process of becoming more conscious, which of course is a good thing, but how it's talked about and how much time it can take up in group work can be, at least in my experience in mixed groups in particular, has been a source of tension. And I just wonder what what the advantage is to people of color to come into a mixed group where there might be that kind of unconscious enactment, to use that language, of a racial complex, and it may or may not actually get uh, taken up in the way that the group is being facilitated. Am I
Mhm.
being clear, or is that somewhat cloudy?
Yeah. It's a little cloudy, but that's okay. Um, but I think that there is a need for um, and some people, of course, would not agree with me, but there is a need for um, affinity groups that have to do with raising white consciousness. I have a friend, colleague, Walter McNeary, and his partner, Kathy, who do work in Seattle, and they do work with whites and white affinity groups, because there is that, frustration, or there is that, I don't even want to call it a frustration. I want to call it we've lived with this for centuries experience by people of color, and we get tired of, we're tired of teaching white people how to behave or what to do or how to think in terms of us, right? Like, oh, you're
Mhm.
waking up now. That's fabulous.
Right.
That's great.
That's what I'm
you
talking
know,
about.
and we've been carrying this for centuries, and we're just tired now. Oh, you're finally waking up. Okay, good. So now we could step back and let you, like I said earlier, carry that stone, up
Mm,
the mountain and down it
mm,
for, I don't know, maybe not a century, but, for as long as you need to,
mm,
to have understanding, and to be to learn how to be okay with yourselves. Like, how are you okay with your whiteness? Look at American history, and the way it has been exclusionary and inequitable and all of that, and talk amongst yourselves, and then see what you come up with about how you want to make change, about how we live in America. because it's not, like I said, it's not Black people's problems. It became our problems, right? But the racism is built into the structure of American society, the structures of American society. So what happens there? Like, how much do you want us to do? We people of color, right? And what can you do? So I think this idea of affinity groups, I think it's not a bad idea. I think it's a good idea, as a
Mm.
matter of fact. And then it lessens the burden and the load for people of color. And so, when whites feel they have some understanding and they have a working vocabulary, that shows an understanding of their own shadow, the collective shadow of racism, their own unconsciousness, like around raciality, when they feel more versed in that, because they've done some inner work, then you could come and be a part of a mixed group, and because then you can have some white humility, perhaps, and some empathy, and not being so scared that you don't open your mouth, or so scared that nothing moves forward in this space, right? And I think a part of that white fragility is that, unconscious way that you can expect, like, Black people have to be treated in a particular way because not only are they the problem, but they've got to figure it out themselves and make it work, as if whiteness doesn't have anything to do with that.
Mm. Whiteness. We can have a whole other conversation about the ubiquitousness of whiteness. It's
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
we just have a couple of minutes for today, and I just thought maybe if we could speak a little bit more about this thought of bringing the light and
Hmm.
tapping the community unconscious as a way of seeking guidance for us as a community, including through the labyrinth of concerns that we've just outlined. Do you actually feel that the unconscious, the community unconscious, is a resource as a way forward?
I think so. I think community is really important. And I think that, when we look at social dreaming, right? And hopefully we'll get to do some of that, right? As a part of my segment, like, maybe someone will bring a dream, and that would be for us in our community in a few weeks. I think that there's a way, if we can go to the unconscious that holds us, right, and say, we're looking for some more healing around raciality, right, and around ethnic problems that we have. Like, how do we do that, right? Like, how do we do that? I think that we would perhaps get more answers about healing. If we go only to the ego, we're going to get egoic responses that can be helpful for a little while, but like maybe like short-term therapy, like where it solves something at the surface, but then the thing underneath it keeps being activated, right? So if we, like, even for example, like understanding that a complex gets constellated, right? It becomes alive, and something at the center of that wants to dominate. Like, even to begin to learn how to feel into one's body. That's why I think it's so important about the body, and how we understand the energy in our bodies, and how one body in the space with another, as in the therapy setting, right? Or with family therapy, like, it really matters the energy level, and why we can talk about a phenomenological field, that even the consciousness to come together, like what we're going to do and how we're going to be, even though it's on Zoom, like in the next few weeks, to me, gives us an opportunity to feel one another in the body, to feel ourselves in the body, and then to feel one another with our bodies, and then to see what that feels like, because I think that helps to shift consciousness, right? I really do. And I'm sorry that we won't be able to be in person in the room, but perhaps next year, if we meet again, we'll be able to be not in our Zoom room, but in the room at Antioch, and we can dance together. We can put
Mm.
on music and really be in our bodies in
Mm.
that space with one another, with drumming that's happening there. We
Yeah.
can have drumming now, but have that drumming there, and
Okay.
and awaken
Yeah.
us. We can all be woke in that way too,
Yeah.
which I think would be so fabulous,
Oh,
would be really great.
oh, I love that. So we've just hatched our follow-up event for a year from now, which will
Hmm.
be dancing and drumming together, and we'll have
Yeah.
a point of reference of our bodies together and our bodies in this sort of virtual
Hmm.
togetherness. I mean, some of
Hmm.
what I'm gathering listening to you is that racism at some level is a form of dissociation from the body
Hmm.
and within the psyche, and that in some way, the more that we can become embodied together, the more that we do perhaps have a chance of radically healing
Hmm. Hmm.
from the
Absolutely.
effects of of racism,
Hmm.
all of us. Somehow that's
Hmm.
what I just heard when I was listening to you.
I think that that's true. I think that's true.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think that we have to be, with one another. You use the word ritualistic. I think we need to be with one another in rituals of healing. And I think the conversations that we're having, and I think that's why Zoom, I think it does work really well,
Mm.
around these kinds of conversations. And why it does is because it's creating a ritual of conversation that isn't only happening now in a one-to-one in the therapy room, but has had a broader field to kind of ripple through and across because of Zoom,
Mhm.
right? Because so many more of us can come together and talk together and be with one another in a space that we were not in before, right? So it makes a difference. I think it does create a certain level of embodiment, to be together, and a shift in consciousness. So I'm more and more for groups.
Well, Dr. Fanny Brewster, it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you today and being in this ritual of conversation with you. And
Mhm.
I am eager to invite others into our ritual of conversation on May 23rd,
Mhm.
2021, from 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. And for more information about that event, you can email us at SDP, that's the letters S is in spirit, D is in depth, P is in psychology, sdp.aula at antioch.edu. And we will forward you the link so that you can join us. We'll need to end here for now. And thanks once again to Dr. Fanny Brewster. It's been such a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Matt. And and we'll connect again soon. Thank you for the invitation.